Yo, what up? Welcome to the first episode of the Dirty Southcast. I'm the Trill OG, Bun B, repping UGK for life. Thank y'all for tuning in. For those of you watching live, thank you so much for being a part of the first episode. For those of you watching later, thank you for checking in. If you haven't already subscribed, make sure and hit that subscribe button. You know what I'm saying? We appreciate all our followers, everybody that supports us and everything. We got a couple of people starting to come in now that we done went live. And it took me a while to figure this out because I don't really do YouTube in that way. You know what I'm saying? But we here now. And thank y'all for joining us. Today, we thought we would start the podcast in a different way because the way that I would like to present it would be to have different people that represent the South, and not just musically. I feel like that's easy for me to just get other rappers from the South to come in and, you know, talk about UGK and talk about music and shit like that. But I want to try to create this as a platform to embrace everything that encompasses the South. You know what I'm saying? So we want to talk to musicians. We want to talk to singers. We want to talk to athletes. We want to talk to politicians. We want to talk to chefs. We want to talk to writers, directors, everybody that is repping the South in the best way they see. You know what I'm saying? Again, this is my first time doing this. We've done a couple of podcasts before. Some of y'all might remember, of course, the Trill Talk podcast with myself and Queenie and Truck Buck Don't Give a Fuck, which was very fun, very entertaining. We just couldn't, the venue that we was working with took good care of us, but it just became a lot for them to do. And so, you know, they would have to record everything and then edit it and put it together. And we weren't the only people that they had. And so we just couldn't make it work in a timely basis, in a way that I wanted it to work. And, you know, I don't have any regrets about it. We all had a good time with it. We all learned a lot in the course of doing it. And so, but here we are with the Dirty Southcast first edition. We're talking about the album Riding Dirty, which today we're celebrating the 24-year anniversary of Riding Dirty. Riding Dirty is, in my opinion and many people's opinion, the seminal album from UGK. This is the album that we felt and have always felt represented us in the best way. The two albums, well, there was an EP and two albums prior to Riding Dirty. There was the EP Southern Way, and then there was Too Hard to Swallow and Super Tight. And while we were proud of those albums, you know what I'm saying, we never felt like we had the pure freedom to do those albums in the way that we wanted to do those albums. We went through a lot of label politics and industry politics, sample clearance and shit like that. You know what I'm saying? And so those albums were never really 100% division of myself and Pimp. So when it came time to do Riding Dirty, we told the record company, look, we don't want to take the money. We don't want like a bunch of money up front. We want freedom. Just allow us to turn in the album and for y'all to put it out, right? Like, so if we decide we're going to sample a record, we're going to look into it. We're going to make sure that it's not a costly sample. We're going to make sure that it's not going to be something that's real difficult to clear or whatever, because that would always be the problem. Like, well, we like this song, but the sample costs too much and it's going to take too long to get it cleared and shit like that. So we went into making Riding Dirty under the pretense of that not being a reason for them to not fuck with the project, for them to not let us release the album the way that we wanted it to be released. And the other thing was, and this is, Pimp was just years ahead of his time in terms of recording. And make no mistake about it, UGK is the vision of Pimp C, right? Like, I was a partner in the group, but as far as making the music, presenting the album, like, I would come up with the album titles and like hooks and different things, but the whole idea and concept of what UGK was, what it was supposed to represent, how it would look to people, that was all Pimp. And I would always get frustrated because the dude was so talented and so many years ahead of his time, and they never allowed him the freedom to show people just how good he really was. And so for Riding Dirty, Pip wanted it to have a different sound and a different feel, right? So what he wanted to do was build a soundscape around actual playing. So instead of it being like us sampling records, if there was a record that he wanted to sample, he wanted to at least try to recreate the record. And so we actually brought in, we put together a band. And so the first thing we started with was Pimp wanted to remake a song from the, different songs from the Meters, different guitar breaks from the Meters. And every time he tried to sample it, he felt like it wasn't hitting right. It never was hitting right. And so he came to the point where he was like, yo, I want to reach out to the guitar player for the Meters. His name is Leo Nosatelli. He's a funk legend, guitar playing legend in the game. So we reached out to him, and as crazy as it sounded, from these young kids wanting him to come and play for us, he accepted. And so we brought him to the house. Smitty, what up, little bro? We brought him to the house in PA. 1017 San Jacinto was the house we was living in at the time. And he came to the house. He linked us up with a bass player, Chris Severin, also a musical legend, and a keyboard player, David. I can't think of David's last name. I meant to ask Mr. Leo about that before I came on here. And so we had like a full band playing in our living room, playing all the music that Pimp wanted to do for the album. And so he would be like, okay, well, this is the song I want to remake. And so you guys do it in the way that you feel comfortable with doing it. And so they would go in and they would do these jam session versions of these records. So they would play the record the way it would typically go. And then the guitar player would do a solo for a while. The bass player would do a solo for a while. And the organ player would do a solo for a while. And so we did this for many records. And if you listen to the outro of Riding Dirty, the outro for Riding Dirty is the actual jam session that he went back and sampled and put together Diamonds and Wood. But the outro is the actual full jam session that he's just kind of talking over. And so we did that for a number of records. And so in Pimp's mind, it was like, it would have the fullness and the full sound that you would normally have from live instrumentation, but then he went back and sampled each part. So he would go back and listen to everything that the guitar player did on that song and find the best pass, right? Find the best part of the song that the guitar player, where he hit everything in the way he wanted him to hit it. He would sample that. Then he went back and did the same thing with the bass, sampled that, did the same thing with the organ and sampled that, and then put those pieces together with his own drum patterns. And that's how, some of the songs were created. And so if you listen to Riding Dirty, if you put Riding Dirty in your stereo or play it on your MP3 player or in iTunes, however it is that you listen to music, you cut it on and you play Riding Dirty on 5, right? Turn the volume up to, let's say, 5 or 10, whatever. I say 5 because I'm old school enough. The max you could do was 10. Obviously, the numbers go crazy than that. But just put Riding Dirty at a certain volume and listen to it and play it, right? And then play another album from 95, 96, any era for that matter, and play it at the same volume. And you're going to notice that shit don't hit the same. You know what I'm saying? The way Pimp recorded the music, the way he mixed it, the way he mastered it, it had a fuller sound, and that shit hit different. And it still to this day hits different and sound different, more different than anything else that you can hear from that era. Because that's what he wanted, right? He wanted our shit had to jam, our shit had to hit a certain way, it had to feel a certain way. And for us as a group and I talked about this earlier today, that we didn't have like what every other artist had. We didn't have the videos. We didn't have big marketing campaigns. We didn't have big promotional campaigns. So we just kind of, UGK happened by word of mouth, And so because of that, Pimp was like, look, this music, it was 2 parts to it, right? It was like the music has to hit different, right? Because we're not going to get all the advantages that everybody else gets in order to make them look like the shit, as far as being artists is concerned. So our music got to hit different. The other part of it was replicating the experience on stage. So Pimp was a real stickler for for the way that we presented ourselves on stage, right? So we would go to sound checks. We would take sound check very seriously. We would have a list of equipment that we felt was necessary so that when people came to the show and heard us do the music, that it felt like and sounded like it did when you listened to the shit in your car or at the crib or whatever. And we got into it with sound men for years about it, right? And the reason we got into it with them was because when the show promoter for a venue, right, like for a concert hall or, you know, like a Warehouse Live or a House of Blues or some shit like that, right? Like when you have a place like that and they bring in a sound man, the sound man will say, well, I can give you the C sound, the B sound, or the A sound. And most people would take the C sound. They pick the cheapest sound so they can make the most money from the show. And we would demand that they upgrade all the way to the A. We needed everything they had, the amps, the best speakers. We needed everything that they had because a lot of times when people's first time actually seeing UGK was in person. They really didn't see us in magazines. They ain't see us on TV, shit like that. So their first time seeing us would be live on stage in person. And so we didn't want to fuck up that experience for people. And we didn't want to be misrepresented out there because in the early days of going on tour and shit like that, if you went to a concert, and maybe even today to a certain level, right? If you go to a concert and the sound ain't right, you don't know shit about the sound, man. You don't know shit about the venue. If the shit don't sound right, you blame the rappers. You blame the people on stage. And we didn't want to get blamed for some shit that didn't have nothing to do with us. And contractually, if your sound wasn't up to a certain level, we wouldn't even do the show. Like we would be like, fuck this shit's fucked up. And even if it went good at sound check and it went bad on stage, we would immediately be like, sound man, get that shit together, get this shit right. These people paid their music. And we would try to explain the process to people so they would understand that if shit was fucked up, it wasn't our fault. You know what I'm saying? It didn't sit well with a lot of promoters. We got into it with a lot of promoters over that kind of shit. Definitely got into it with a lot of sound man, called many sound men bitches, hoe ass niggas and fuck niggas and shit like that over many years. But all of that kind of went into, if you went to a UGK show and you seen stuff like that, it kind of went into the mystique of the group. And so we went in and we did Riding Dirty. And at the time, if you listen to Riding Dirty, there's a lot of 3-2 on Riding Dirty. And the reason you hear so much of 3-2 on Riding Dirty is because at that time, we were considering making 3-2 the third member of UGK. And 3-2 comes into the fold as a friend, but then also with the record One Day. So the record One Day, which is one of the first records recorded for the Riding Dirty album, One Day was actually a 3-2 solo record for his first solo album. So 3-2 had come over and had played us his full solo album. And One Day was like the last song on that album. And, you know, he cut it off and he was like, what you think? And, you know, Pimp was like, man, that whole jam and that One Day though, that's the best, that's the hit. Like that's the hit record on this album, is the One Day record. And rest in peace to 3-2 for sure, the governor, Chris Berrier. And 3-2 was like, yeah, it's cool, but it's too slow, it's too sad and all that type of shit. You know what I'm saying? I don't think I'm gonna put it on the album. And Pimp was like, you crazy. That's the best record you got. He's like, all that other shit is good, but the One Day record is the shit. One Day, original One Day, which I saw on Wikipedia, they tried to say that it was produced by Pimp C and N.O. Joe. That's not true. The original version of One Day was produced by a brother named Big Boss. Big Boss was, rest in peace to Big Boss. Big Boss was one of the founding members of one of the first groups on Rap-A-Lot called OG Style. And so Big Boss produced the One Day record. And 3-2 was like, man, I'm not putting that shit on my album. That shit too slow and it's too sad. So Pimp was like, give it to me. I'll put it out. Give it to me. It's a hit record. If you don't want it, give it to us. So that's why when you listen to One Day, the first verse is 3-2, because that's the first verse that was on the original album version that he made. And then we just ended up jumping on the second verse and the third verse of the song. But we had so much respect for 3-2 and his level of talent. And he was just around us a lot. You know what I'm saying? During those sessions, 3-2 was around a lot. The Botany Boys, C-No, Dirty Red, and Will Lean. Dez, DEZ, Dez was locked up, I think, at this time. But the Botany Boys were a big part of the Riding Dirty sessions as well, because, C-Note would come through with the smoke, with the green. It was called Cuz. It was like what you would call mid-grade, right? Somewhere between Dirty Weed and Chronic, right? And so they would come to the studio, and we would all be smoking and making his music. And that's how 3-2 ended up on so many different records. And we were very, very close to adding 3-2 to the group at the time, but it ended up not working out, which I think was for the best, in hindsight. But you can't downplay 3-2's contributions on Riding Dirty and 3-2's contributions to the UGK legacy. You know what I'm saying? Another group of people that we were around at the time was another one of the early groups signed to Rap Loud Records, which was Royal Flush, which was Rick Royal and Al B. And a lot of the brothers around them, particularly Big Money. Most people would know him as, from back then, you know him as Big Money or Big Mun or whatever. Mun was originally from the West Coast, moved to Texas as a teenager, became a part of the hip hop scene. And he was definitely like a mentor to us, like from a street perspective, in terms of how we would navigate the streets and the way we would just move in the streets. You know what I'm saying? He was always around with us as well. But we spent a lot of time around those brothers and had a lot of influence from them, from just being in the game before us and having navigated a lot of the shit that we had navigated. Now, they had very different ways of the way they made music, the way they presented music and all of that. But their workmanship, right? Their work ethic was something that we had a lot of respect for, because they lived and breathed music kind of in the same way that we look to live and breathe music. So we took a lot of inspiration from them. To this day, I think that there's a song by Rick from Royal Flush called I Never Made 20. And that was always Pimp's single favorite rap song, period, out of everything. And Pimp had a lot of admiration, a lot of love for a lot of people. But if you get a chance, look up the song I Never Made 20 by Royal Flush. It's incredibly well written, years ahead of its time. It's kind of like it's kind of like Love's Gonna Get You, right? But a lot more hardcore in terms of the storytelling and shit like that. And so one of the other members of that group was this guy, Serge. Serge was a producer and shit like that. And, Serge was another OG we took a lot of advice from, was always, giving us stuff. And so Serge ended up producing the record Good Stuff on Riding Dirty. So outside of One Day and Good Stuff, the majority of the production on Riding Dirty and UGK in general was Pimp C, which was crazy because I've talked to so many people, right, about UGK, and people ask me all the time, well, no, not Raw Flush, Iced Out Medallions. That's the New York rapper. This is a group, Raw Flush. So if you're going to Google it, look up Raw Flush Rap A Lot Records. That'll be the artist to look up. And people be like, well, man, who produced this record? And I'd be like, oh, Pimp produced that. Who produced this record? Oh, Pimp produced that. You know what I'm saying? And I don't think people really understood the level of talent that Pimp had. You know what I'm saying? The foresight, all of these different records. And there's a lot of records that you heard from UGK, maybe on the 4th album or the 5th album, that Pimp would produce prior to those albums and then be like, well, it ain't time for that record yet. Like, I'll give you a perfect example. We have a record on the UGK album. I want to say it's on the Underground Kings album. And it's called Quit Hating the South. It's UGK featuring Willie D. Now, Quit Hating the South was a record that Pimp produced. I want to say the first time Pimp produced Quit Hating the South would have been during Super Tight. So he produced it, had the same hook. And he was like, no, it ain't time for this record yet. So he cut the music off and erased the song and never talked about it again. And then I want to say he came up with it again. I don't think he came up with it again for Riding Dirty. I think it came up during Dirty Money. And He's like, nah, it still ain't time. It still ain't time for this record. And he went to jail. And when he came back home from jail, that's when, Southern hip hop had risen, right? Like that's when the whole Houston explosion, Swisher House, Screwed Up Click, the Mike Jones, Paul Wall, Slim Thug, Chameleonaire, that whole era started to happen. And he came home and he was like, well, these dudes are selling big records and they making big moves and they still don't want to show these dudes the respect that they deserve. And so he was like, now it's time to do this record. And that's just the kind of foresight that Pimp had in terms of making music. The Ride Dirty sessions, Ride Dirty was entirely produced. All the pre-production and all of the production for Riding Dirty was done at the house. So we did everything in the house. All the vocals were recorded. We recorded in the bathroom with a Radio Shack mic. And we eventually went to a full service studio and redid some of the vocals. Some of them still work. And but we did a lot of the music in the house at that time. And we did other records in that house during that same era. This is where a lot of the records we did with Master P happened. P would come down to Port Arthur. Shout out to No Limit Records for their BET, the documentary that they're doing right now. But P would come to the house and be like, if he'd come to the house, it would literally be on like a Sunday. And he'd be like, I got to turn this album in tomorrow and I need y'all on this record. And that's where like Kick Dough and Break You Off Something, that's where those collaborations came from. And the crazy shit is, like, even especially with Break You Off Something, like, because that was a record that we did from scratch, right? And Break You Off Something, like, Pimp made the beat. We all laid our vocals in the house that day, and he took the song. We recorded on DAT. He took the song, and he left, and then Pimp cut the machine off, right? Erased all the music, all the files. And it wasn't until later that we realized that he never cut an instrumental version of Break You Off Something. So to this day, there's no instrumental for Break You Off Something. There's no clean version. There's no instrumental. We never cut those versions of that record. But I feel like, that was the time where we did like a lot of our best work. We had our best chemistry because we literally were recording music and doing everything in the house that we lived in. Like we woke up in that house, we went to sleep in that house. We did other things in that house. I met my wife in that house. I met her at one house, but that's when I decided she was going to be she decided she was going to be my woman when she came to that house. But there's so many of the things that helped to cement our legacy happened at 1017 San Jacinto. You can still, if you go to Port Arthur, Texas, you can go and pass by 1017 San Jacinto. The house is still there. Some people own the house. We wanted to buy the house and turn it into like a mini museum. They didn't really want to sell it, but they're not doing nothing with it. And then the house got destroyed real bad in the last hurricane. But anyway, that's where a lot of our great memories happen. A lot of great musical moments happened in that house. And that's the house that Riding Dirty, the whole idea of Riding Dirty and everything happened in that house. And it was crazy because, Pip would wake up like sometimes like on days where we weren't even recording, Pip would like wake up at 3, 4 in the morning and go in the studio and start making the beat and then come knock on my door and be like, Bum B, come check this record out. And I'd be like, this is tight. This is tight. I like this song. And then we would sit there and we would come up with a hook or something just so we could have like an idea of what the song would be. And then we would come back to it the next day and actually flesh out that whole idea. And, just the ability to, which everybody kind of has now, like a lot of up and coming artists now, music equipment is a lot cheaper. Like you buy a laptop and you can you get GarageBand and shit like that. And it's easy to have these computer programs, Pro Tools and Studio One and shit like that, where you can, record right there in the moment. And that was the beauty of Riding Dirty. The fact that we were able to, whenever we had an idea for something, that we could just go in and record it and knock it out. And once we had the songs that we felt worked for the album, the most important part to Pimp of any album is the sequence, right? The order that you put songs in. And if any of y'all watch Versus, right? That's a big part of Versus. You could have the bigger, better records in these Versus competitions, but if you don't put this music in the right order, you could end up like losing the Versus just because you didn't structure everything the right way, you know? And so we went through a couple of different versions of how Riding Dirty was supposed to flow together. And the first couple of versions of it didn't work. You know what I'm saying? I remember Mama West was very much like this don't sound good. Like the music is good, but it's not work. This don't sound right, you know? And he kept going at it. And this is with every album. Pimp put together the order of every album. So we would go and we would record everything, and then Pimp would sit with the music and try to figure out the best way for the album to kind of flow. You don't want too many fast records in a row. You don't want too many slow records in a row. An album's got to have a good feel and a good flow to it. You know what I'm saying? And so when he finally got it, he was like, "This is it, Bun B. This is the order. This is how it's supposed to go right here." And we listened to it a couple of times in a row, and I couldn't think of any reason why it shouldn't go like the way he was saying. And that's the one that we sent it off to mastering, and it came back, and we knew we had one. Now, did we know this was going to be our best album at the time? Yes, it was our best album. Did we know it would be the seminal album? You know what I'm saying? I don't believe so. But we knew we was jamming like a motherfucker on there. And this was the album where we knew people really couldn't fuck with us, right? Like there was a lot of other people, musical contemporaries, people that we had a lot of respect for making music at the same time. But we felt like, look, this is the one, man. Can't nobody fuck with this. Nobody's really talking like this. Even all the way down to the song Riding Dirty. Riding Dirty is a Wes Montgomery sample. And that was a song that I had always wanted to rap to, right? And it's different. And it's different on purpose. You know what I'm saying? And Pimp loved the idea of like talking about street shit to music that's not necessarily street-based music. You know what I'm saying? Like Cocaine in the Back of the Ride. If you listen to Cocaine in the Back of the Ride, Cocaine in the Back of the Ride is a Bob Marley record, right? It's like a roots reggae record. It's not even a dance hall, a street Jamaican music. You know what I'm saying? Like you would get from like a Buju or Vibes, right? This was like straight roots reggae. And so just the whole idea of doing this real hardcore street music over music that didn't have that kind of feeling, you know what I'm saying, was always intriguing to us. It was always a good thing to kind of turn things on its head. I see my boy Max Manili in here. Max Manili's talk about Murder. So Murder, and I think I've talked about this a couple of times. Murder is always, when people think of me as an artist, Murder is always the record that comes to mind. I was always like from that battle rap world, right? Where I always felt like I was at my best when I was rapping against people, like rapping at somebody as opposed to rapping to people. Pimp was real good at rapping to people, talking to people. I felt like I needed to talk at people. You know what I'm saying? So talking to people is like, you're saying things within a group of people and communicating with them and everybody's feeling you. Rapping at people is like, hey, I'm talking to you, motherfucker, type of thing. You know what I'm saying? And Pimp would always brag about, like, I was the best rapper, could nobody out-rap me and all of that stuff. But a lot of the music that UGK did was a lot more slow-paced. It was a lot more laid-back, cool, chill-out music. And it didn't really afford me the opportunity to really prove how good of a rapper I was, like skill set-wise. You know what I'm saying? And so Riding Dirty, I was like, look, man, we're going to need you're going to have to give me a record that allows me to show motherfuckers I could really, really rap. And so Murder ended up being that record. And so the day we were supposed to record that record, I had went out the night before, I had partied or whatever. I was, still fucked up from the night before, just to be honest. I was still fucked up from the night before. And so I came over to the studio and Murder was the song that was playing. And so I sat down, I wrote my rhyme, and then I went to sleep. Like I said, I was still kind of fucked up from the night before. So I went to sleep. And I actually went to sleep. We were at this studio, this guy Skip's studio in Katy, and he had like this huge SSL board, right? It was this huge board. And I literally went underneath the board and went to sleep while they like tracked out the record and laid everything out. And they did all of that and they put the scratches in and Pimp did his verse. And then they woke me up and it was like, yo, Bun, it's time for you to do your verse. So I got up, I went in, and so Riding Dirty, this is another thing about Riding Dirty. Shout out to Skip Holman. Riding Dirty is the first rap album that I'm aware of recorded on Pro Tools. And that was all about N.O. Joe. So N.O. Joe was the one that brought us to the studio when it came time to track everything out and relay vocals and stuff like that. And he was like, I'm gonna take you out to this dude Skip's spot. Skip got, he's got this huge sound library because there's a lot of different sounds we wanted to put in, car sounds, gun sounds, and shit like that. And this dude had the biggest sound library pretty much in America. Skip's job was, Skip used to do a lot of commercials for people. Like you listen to AutoZone commercial and you hear cars starting and horns and shit like that. Like he would be the guy that they would contact to do a lot of that stuff. And so that's what we went there for primarily. But then, Joe was telling us he had this new way of recording in Pro Tools. And so back in the day, before Pro Tools, which pretty much everybody that records now, that's how they record, is in like a digital program. But everything before then was analog. And so the difference between analog and digital is that you were actually recording to a tape. You were recording onto an actual tape. And so every time you wanted to lay something, you had to set the tape up right to where you wanted to come in. You wrap that shit, and if you messed up, you had to rewind the tape all the way back. And you had to do the verse correctly. Like you couldn't just insert where you wanted to. Like nowadays, they have where you rap and say you write a 16-bar verse, you get 8 bars good, and then you can't get that 9th bar right. So they can just pick you up and punch you in, which means insert you right at the beginning of that 9th bar. You can pick it up like you never broke your vocal stride, so to speak, right? It doesn't look like it's interrupted, And so this was the first time you could actually do that. But I always felt like you couldn't. If you did that, anything that you use, what I would call like studio tricks in order to record something, it would be very hard for you to duplicate that on stage. And remember, I said earlier, a big part of UGK was about being able to replicate everything we did on the record on stage. And so they kept telling me, I did the verse the first time and I messed up right toward the end. And they was like, that's okay. We can punch you in right there. And I'm like, no, I'm not finna punch. And it took me years to even embrace the idea of punching in. No, I'm not high. I'm not high at all. Somebody had talking about I'm high as fuck. I couldn't be more sober right now. And so I went back and did the entire song all the way through. So the version of my verse that you hear on Murder is literally the second take. Because I was always a perfectionist about my lyrical ability. I want to be able to make sure if I wrote the rhyme, I could say the rhyme in the booth. I could say it in person. I could say it on the street. I could say it on stage. Any of that shit, all of that shit. And so, and we ended up doing it, and it was very obvious to everybody that we played Murder for that there was no precursor to Murder, in the sense that nobody had ever really rapped in that way from the South. They go months. I woke up, wrote that verse in 20 minutes. Nobody had ever really rapped like that from the South. There had been rappers like Rick Royal had that level of intensity, that level of lyrical ability. But Rick was originally from the East Coast, so he kind of brought that East Coast aggressive nature to his music. But nobody really from the South had really rapped like that before, you know? And it kind of set the tone for rappers after that, like the T.I.s, the Killer Mikes, the Ludacris's, to one, not only show your lyrical ability, but then two, to be able to still be distinctly Southern, right? So, you know, a lot of times before that, it would be, you know, if you tried to be too lyrical on a record from the South, people would say you trying to rap like you from the East Coast. And I never wanted that to be an issue. I wasn't ever trying to rap like I was from the East Coast. I wanted to show that I was good enough to rap next to anybody from anywhere, specifically rappers from the East Coast. You know what I'm saying? And when we did that, it allowed other Southern rappers to see it and be like, oh, okay, well, shit, I'm finna go for mine too, you know? So I'm very proud of that verse. A lot of people say that's one of the best verses ever. I appreciate that. I respect that. I argue that it's not necessarily my favorite verse. I feel like Pinky Ring, my verse on Pinky Ring is a bad motherfucker. 2, my verse on 316s is a bad motherfucker as well. I've done some other verses that are really good, but I can understand why people go to that verse because of how many bars it was, the intensity of it, and the fact that it kind of opened the doors for people after me, which I had no idea that that's what that was doing. They kind of opened the doors for people to be able to express themselves fully and be everything that they wanted to be lyrically without having to compromise their Southernness. Somebody said that's why I carry my gun. That's also a good ass verse. But yeah, no, Murder was the record that I asked Pimp to make for me to be able to show my ability. He made that record for me, and I feel like I showed it. And shit, I guess the rest is history. Queen, is there anything you want to talk about? We're riding dirt. Queen? No. Well, you could say no. Don't just sit there. I can't see you shaking your head. It's dark over there. Shout out to the Queen. That's how I did to do this tonight. And then she totally just left me over here hanging by myself. I asked her to help me out, read the questions and stuff. But that's going to be what that's going to be. See if I can go through here and see some of these questions that people are asking. Yeah, so Diamonds and Wood, they asked about how did Diamonds and Wood come together. And Diamonds and Wood is a vocal sample, of course, from a Screw tape. And, Screw music at the time was a real big influence on the city and the culture. And so if you look at the whole concept of Ride Dirty is really, it's a concept album about riding through what the city of Houston was like at that time, specifically the South Side of Houston. So that's why you have records like Diamonds and Wood. Diamonds and Wood is a studio version of what a song on a Screw tape kind of feels like. You know what I'm saying? And, that was one of the records that he really wanted to make, really talking about, what it felt like. Diamonds and Wood is supposed to let you know what it felt like if you actually had a candy painted car riding on folds and folds and flipping through the South Side and what those guys was going through, because it was a very contentious time in the city of Houston. The North Side and the South Side wasn't necessarily getting along at the time. And, we just tried to emulate how that felt for people at the time. Even if you look at the song about Riding Dirty, like the whole concept of the album cover, the whole idea of the album cover is actually getting jacked on the South Side. You know what I'm saying? if you look at us in a bourbon and the album cover is just like looking back because we're actually in the process of getting jacked. If you open up the artwork, you see us actually getting jacked. We're getting jacked by the Botany Boys. The bourbon we was in was actually C-Note bourbon, well-known truck. On the south side of Houston. It actually was a bourbon on blades. That one actually wasn't on swingers. Swingers wasn't something you would put on a bourbon back then, but it was actually a black bourbon on blades. And you know, we getting jacked, and we actually shot those pictures in front of Screw's house, in front of the house back then. And you know, it was something that we made the album, we brought it to Screw, let Screw hear it. If you listen, there's a Riding Dirty Screw tape. And so when we brought the album to Screw, we let him pick which songs he wanted, which instrumentals he wanted to chop up and have us rap over. And so that's kind of like that's why we're rapping over the songs that we're rapping over the Riding Dirty Screw. Somebody asks, is that me on the skits? No, it's not me on the skits. So if you listen to Riding Dirty, there's a lot of skits, they're vocal skits. And a lot of people for a long time thought it was me, but that's actually a good friend of ours. His name is Smoke D from Jackson, Mississippi. Smoke D was actually going to be the first artist signed to UGK. Smoke D ended up in a situation, found himself in prison for a while. So what we did was we sent him a personal like DAT recorder, and the DAT. So it was a professional machine that we could use to pull vocals from that would work with the album. So it wouldn't sound like just a regular cassette, but it was the same size as like a Walkman. So when we sent it to him, he would record while walking around in the penitentiary. And he would have it like next to his ear, like he was listening to music, but he was actually talking and recording. And so he would be walking around talking about the shit he was seeing, the shit he was hearing, shit like that. And, so when you hear him talking about, man, there's two niggas kissing in here. He's actually walking the tier and seeing two dudes kissing, shit like that. There's a scene like right before murder, you hear him talking to this Colombian dude who got jammed up, and Colombian dude is talking about, how he ended up in jail. Somebody snitched on him. Basically, he was the plug, and he was giving people work, putting people on, black people. And he said, the dudes that he was putting on got jammed up, and they crossed him out, and that's how he ended up in prison. And and so that's who when you talk about goddamn snitches and we need to kill him, that's all, you know what I'm saying? And all the background noise that you hear, none of that is sound from that sound library I was talking about earlier. None of that shit was from that. That's all actual background. That's why we sent him the DAT recorder, because it was it had such a high level of clarity. It would pick up everything in the background. You could hear everything that was happening in the background. And we chopped up, and there was a lot of talking. He did like a lot of talking. He did some rapping and stuff as well, but it wasn't on like a tempo, so we couldn't really put it to no beats or nothing like that. But we put that shit out, and everybody for years thought that was me talking, because he was locked up for a considerable amount of time. And but we never did interviews, so there was no way to really talk about who it was and what was actually happening on the record. Now Smoke is home now. I see him all the time. Whenever I go to Mississippi, I see him. I talk to him regularly. And, he's definitely, like a brother to me, but he's a part of history. He's definitely a part of history on that. And I just, that's some of the funny shit that I listen to. And I laugh about the shit he's saying on that, because it's so wild. He's like, man, like right before Good Stuff, there's a skit where he's talking about, man, I need to give me some hash, some uyayas. He's like, niggas in there, basically talking about, dudes in prison jacking off. And he's like, he never wanted to jack off. He's like, I'm not finna, prostitute myself and molest myself. But I need some pussy. And he was talking about how you hear other skits on that where he's talking about how he's eating free world steak and shrimp. You know what I'm saying? He's not just eating regular, commissary food. And not even just stole, like he had privileges. He was getting like real food in now, you know. And it's all classic shit. We had so much shit that he was saying, and we had meant to put it on other projects, but it didn't fit, right? So when it came time to do Dirty Money, it didn't fit on there. But there would be times we would just sit around at the crib on San Jack and just smoke and listen to that shit and just trip out laughing at the shit he was seeing and the shit he was talking about. You know, that's my brother Smoke D. Somebody's on here asking, is the outro instrumental available? No, none of that stuff is available. We meant to put out the instrumental album, and somebody asked me that earlier. Wasn't it supposed to be 3 versions? Wasn't it like the Ride Clean, Riding Dirty, and Riding Screwed? And instead of doing the Riding Screwed, we ended up doing like an actual screw tape with us freestyling and that shit. You know, it's crazy how, you know, we ended up just, instead of just scrolling, and that's another thing that Pimp wanted to do before a lot of people knew it. Pimp was like, yo, we need to do a slow down version of Riding Dirty. The record company refused to distribute it, and they wouldn't allow us to do it ourselves. And that's why, you know, we just ended up doing like the freestyles over the instrumental. But that was another thing Pimp wanted to do years before people was doing it, you know, or just doing like, he wanted to do like a whole chopped screwed version of Riding Dirty. Now you see it all the time. Like you see it and you hear him all the time. But back then, if nobody had ever done it, and he wanted to do it in a record company, they didn't understand a lot of the vision that Pimp had. Pimp was years ahead of his time with a lot of that shit. And they just couldn't see the vision. And then like after he went to prison and came back home and everything that he told them was real actually started happening, damn, that's the first thing they had to do was apologize to that man. Let me get some more questions. I got some questions on the page. What track are you most fond of when listening back? Riding Dirty, I think it usually always goes back to One Day. You know, it always goes back to One Day. Because we started losing people after that. And then I had a lot of people who lost people, and that song started meaning so much to them. And I think of all the records that we made, it's the one that still feels the same way, you know. It still means exactly what it meant then, now, you know. Losing loved ones, you know, trying to carry on their memory, all of that type of stuff. And obviously, you know, when I think about Pimp, you know, One Day is one of those records, you know, you never think you'd write your own type of record in that sense. And, you know, it's rough sometimes. You know, I don't make as much music as I would like to, because it's not fun as it once was. It took a while for me to really even enjoy the process of making music after Pimp passed away. You know, I just didn't enjoy it as much. I never wanted to be a solo artist. The only reason I made solo records was because Pimp went to jail, and I felt that was the best way to keep the name alive, keep UGK alive, and keep his name alive. And so that's the only reason I did solo records. I never wanted to be a solo artist because I was in the greatest group of all time, you know? And so I made solo records out of necessity, but it never was the same. You know what I'm saying? Once Pimp passed away, it never was the same. And it still isn't, but Pimp wouldn't want me to not do this. Pimp was like my biggest fan in terms of pushing me and, you know, always talking about how talented I was, how good a rapper I was and shit like that. And so, you know, that's my best way to honor him, is to keep going, to stay productive, keep making his music for people, keep representing. But no, I didn't do it a lot back then. You know, I mean, after he passed away, it just was not fun. You know, it wouldn't, and it's not that I would be too sad to do it. It just wasn't fun without Chad. Chad was a really, really funny dude, very entertaining, you know, and we never argued in the studio. We never we never went back and forth about different ideas. Like pimp was pimp, I was bun, right? So we always had our different approaches to everything. And so we never talk, even if it was about women, we weren't into the same kind of women, so we wouldn't talk about women the same. And so we never stepped on each other's toes or anything with music. And studio sessions with pimp and studio sessions without pimp were two different things, really were two very seriously different things. And I just didn't get the same thing out the experience once pimp was gone. And so I just stopped really doing it. But yeah, so when I think about it, it's probably one day. Somebody asked me what's my favorite Pimp C verse on Riding Dirty. That's a really good question. I think because everybody likes to pay a lot of attention to my verse on Murder, like Pimp set the goddamn tone. And Pimp was always like a really, really good rapper. Pimp was a rapper before, like Pimp was rapping before me. You know what I'm saying? But he never felt that was what Pimp C had to do, was be like, like high end technically. You know what I'm saying? He was extremely capable though. And on any record that I'm like really, really rapping on, I never like left him, right? Like I never left him in terms of I rap so good and he didn't know. Any of those records that are lyrical, like Pimp is right there with me. And so that's why I feel like I would probably pick Murder, Pimp's verse on Murder, because it's a bad motherfucker. You know what I'm saying? And the way he spoke about the streets was amazing. You know what I'm saying? People are still trying to copy his routine. The way he would always say, people are always trying to clone his style. And I used to laugh when he used to say it because I always felt like nobody could have ever really been like him. But when I go back and listen to a lot of this shit now, man, it's a lot of people who tried their best to come across, right? Even if they didn't necessarily rap like him, they couldn't come across like he came across, And I think Murder is like a really fitting example of it, I'm gonna look at some more of these questions on here, see if I can find some more questions. Oh, somebody say y'all talk about switches a lot in y'all music. That was why did y'all choose those? It's not like we really chose it. That was a switch. That was a cigar that was more easily accessible, right? Like, and it's funny because when you go to different places, you see people smoke backwoods. You go places, you see people smoke Phillies and White House and all of that stuff. And it's funny because as you travel the country, like I have people from the East Coast come here. I was just talking about this with Westside Gun the other day. Westside Gun came to Houston, and he couldn't find White House to save his life. And I'm like, you probably ain't gonna find no White House out here. Nobody really smokes those. I never really saw that in a store in the South. But it was the same thing when we would leave Texas. So we got to the point where we wouldn't leave here without actually bringing switches with us because we knew we couldn't find them motherfuckers where we was going. And blunts are a very specific thing. It's kind of like the cigar that you're introduced to is the cigar that you roll with, right? And anybody that smokes weed and cigars knows what I'm talking about. They're all different, right? Like a Swisher is different from a backwood, which is different from a Philly, which is different from a whiteout, right? They all serve the same purpose, but it's a different taste, it's a different flavor, and it's a different smoke. You know what I'm saying? And so, but yeah, that was always the one, the cigar of choice in Houston. That's the now my first blunt, the first blunt I ever smoked was a backwood style cigar. I don't know if it was an actual backwood, but it was a more tobacco based cigar. But like the first blunt that I ever rolled up was a Swisher Sweet, and that was with 3-2. Like 3-2 was the first person I actually saw roll a Swisher, bust it down, break the weed down, and roll it up. And so that ended up being the first blunt that I ever broke down and rolled up and smoked was a Swisher Sweet. And it wasn't like we looked at everything and said this was going to be ours. This was just, that was the one that we always saw down here for some reason. That was what got stopped. Somebody else said Optimos. Yep, definitely Optimos. Did we write and record 3 a.m. at 3 a.m? No. But 3 a.m, the whole point of 3 a.m is the concept of 3 a.m is after the club, right? So that's when a lot of shit really would start happening. Like when you really was trying to get into something, it would be 3 a.m. Because at that point, the club is closed. Like clubs in Texas would close at 2, you know? So you probably stay in the parking lot talking and shooting and shit with people till about 2:30, something like that. And then if you was gonna get into some other street shit, like if you was gonna go to the after hours, or if you was trying to fuck with a broad or something, or a girl was trying to fuck with a dude, that would be that time. Like 3 o'clock would be that magic hour, right? Where if the night's gonna continue, it's gonna continue because you got into something at 3 a.m. So it's either you're gonna get into something or you going home and you laying it down at 3 a.m. You know what I'm saying? And for some people, that's really when the night begins. Because if you're getting into something at 3 a.m, like your night's probably not going to end until the sun comes up. You know what I'm saying? So if you listen to it, that's, we talking about riding around at 3 a.m, you know? In Houston, you was either coming from Carrington's or Jamaica, or some shit like that at that time. And you might leave the club and you might go to Taco Cabana on Main or some shit like that and fuck around over there for a while, try to holler at somebody or something of that nature. Or you'd head to after hours on Scott or something like that, But yeah, that's really what 3 a.m kind of represented. It was like, actually when the real shit was about to begin. And if you didn't have no business being outside, if you wasn't really about that nightlife, at 3 a.m, you might need to be in the house. You was already pushing it. The club closed down at 2. You ain't really outside like that. Take your ass home. Take your ass in. Trying to see if there's really some more questions. I don't really see a lot more questions on here. And I don't really, there's so much about Riding Dirty that I could talk about, but sometimes it's usually about the other people that was there. Somebody said, who is Marcus? Marcus wasn't a specific person. Marcus was actually, that's what we would call mark-ass niggas. We call a nigga Marcus, like Marcus over there. That was like a code name for a mark-ass nigga, was Marcus. And that's pretty much where that came from. I'm sitting here looking through here and I'm trying to see if there's any questions built around Riding Dirty. There's a lot of UGK questions, and shout out to everybody on here talking about Club Strawberries. Yeah, Club Strawberry. We never went on at Club Strawberry before 4 a.m. And that's another thing. If you think about 3 a.m, if you went to Club Strawberries back then, you would go to every other club in Lafayette. Then they would close at 2 o'clock. And then everybody would leave there and start going to Club Strawberries. So you didn't even really get into Strawberries until 3:30. And sometimes you sit out in the parking lot for a while. We would just go and park behind in the back of the club. I knew Bobby Kaye. Bobby Kaye was like a third or fourth cousin of mine, because one of my cousins was a Kaye and he was Bobby's first cousin. So he was kind of like a third cousin of mine. And so yeah, definitely shout out to everybody that was at Club Strawberries. Did I ever try to sing on a hook like Pimp did? Yes, I sang on a song, which has nothing to do with Riding Dirty. I'm just looking at some of these questions. I sang on a song called Like Yesterday. My homeboy Junior, aka PSK 13, real good friend of mine. We used to hang out day for day. And yeah, I did try to sing a hook, but I can't sing. I couldn't sing and I can't sing. But I did sing and I will sing, but I can't sing, and this was maybe if auto-tune would have been available back then, it might have sounded a little different. But yeah, there's a song called Like Yesterday. It's one of the songs I actually like sang a hook on. you know, but it's not great. But I enjoyed it. Looking through here on the chat for some questions. Somebody says my favorite verse from Pimp is for Murder and Pinky Ring. I think Pinky Ring might be one of the most underrated UGK songs of all time. I think it's a perfect demonstration of who we are musically. I think Pinky Ring kind of represents us in a very real, natural way. And I think we went off on that bitch. You know what I'm saying? I just think that because there's so many big ass records on Riding Dirty. But as time goes by, I hear more and more people talking about Pinky Ring. You know what I'm saying? More and more people talk about Pinky Ring was their jam. But I mean, there was a lot of jamming ass songs on Riding Dirty. Like, you know, truth be told, there's a lot of jamming ass songs on Riding Dirty. I could make 10 more albums, and I don't think I'll ever get close to that. I think we were just in the perfect place at the perfect time in life, and we were seeing a lot of shit. We was outside, we was in the streets, we was part of a lot of shit. And we was able to talk about it. We was looking at the South Side. We was watching how the city of Houston was changing and what was going on and how crazy the lifestyle was and the whole screw tape phenomenon taking over the city. And because we weren't from the South Side, that was like our way of connecting with everything that was happening in the South Side. And it's not like we picked the South Side over the North Side or anything like that. It just, that's where a lot of people we was rocking with. I mean, North Side at that time was really just rap a lot. You know, Swisher House wasn't a thing at that time. You know, so there wasn't really an underground rap scene from the North Side. It was only rap a lot. You know, at that time, and then of course Swisher House and Slim and Mike and all these guys came eventually. But back then it was Houston. You know, the identity of Houston was at that time was what was happening on the South Side with the candy painted cars and the swinging and banging and the popping trunks and neon lights and the screw tapes and all of that shit, you know. So I guess that's it. And are there any leftover tracks from Riding Dirty? No. What you heard is what we did. I don't think there's a record that we made that didn't make the album. Like, we were very concise about that. Oh, High Life. Oh yeah, we definitely talk about High Life. High Life was another record. Pimp was real adamant. I'm glad you brought up High Life, yo. High Life was, a lot of street music makes, people like to say it glorifies the street life. I wouldn't say it all necessarily glorifies it, but it doesn't always show both sides. Everybody doesn't really show both sides of living your life in the streets, and Pimp was adamant about showing the good and the bad. And so High Life is a part of showing that everybody out there trying to live that life like it's not a pretty life, right? So if you decide to do it, if that's the world that you want to live in, that it's not going to be all it's cracked up to be. So you hear about the money and the cars and the women and the jewelry and all of that type of shit, but there's a lot of sleepless nights. There's a lot of worries, a lot of concern, particularly with, how your family looks at you, you know what I'm saying? And when you're out there in them streets and, how will God perceive you? You know what I'm saying? It's, like Paco said, they're heaven for a G type of thing, and so High Life was just about talking about, because, there was a lot of things when we showed the benefits of being in the street and what was cool about being in, well, I won't say cool, but what might have been interesting to people about being in the streets. But High Life was about being honest about, the streets is fucked up. And a lot of people not just out in these streets selling drugs and shit because they think it's cool and might be fun and some shit like that. Some people feel like they don't have any other choice to prosper in this world, and that's the decision that they make. And there's a lot of fucked up shit that you got to live with and deal with. Somebody say on here, City King 9 is like the balance of the good and the bad. You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. And you got to be honest about that shit, because music can influence people. Now, I listen to music, and for some people, for some music I listen to, it's it's just music, right? I don't go out and live my life based on what somebody says on the record, but I can see how some people might make that decision, right? And so we always wanted to make sure we was honest. And when he talked about like his family talking about him, you know, what about Baby Joe son Chad, that nigga selling dope? That's true. That's what his family was saying about him at the time. You know, he's talking about Dee Dee getting married. You know, Edgar's on the boat. You know, these are real people. You know, not just making up names. This was like real people. This how his family was looking at him at the time, and him talking about preachers. We knew a preacher that was acting like that at the time, and a lot of that shit is steeped in reality. You know, that shit is steeped in reality. And I mean, I can go on and on about riding dirty, just about all the different, how deep the ramifications are. I'd have to put some people on blast to really tell a lot of that truth about riding dirty. I don't want to put people out there. That ain't for me to do. And that's about it, y'all. I really don't know how much more I can do. Maybe if I get some more information about this stuff, I'll do a follow-up. Riding dirty. We can always talk about riding dirty. I don't need to just be the anniversary to talk about riding dirty. We can always talk about riding dirty. And I guess since my light just went out, guess it's time for me to shut it down. Thank y'all for tuning in to the first episode of the Dirty Southcast. We'll be back shortly. I'll probably come back with a guest. I'll probably do like an interview with somebody. But until then, y'all keep it real.